In the fall of 1953, 4 campers left Atlanta for a quiet weekend along the Chattahoochee. They brought simple gear, planned to fish, and expected nothing more than a calm night under the pines. But before sunset, a strange voice carried across the river. It spoke a single name, clear and close, though no one stood on the opposite bank. As darkness settled, the woods grew silent. The air turned heavy, and something big and moving just beyond the fire's edge, slow, deliberate, and watching. By the time they realized what was circling their camp, it was already too late to pretend it wasn't real. So, before we continue, please make sure to leave a like and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. We left Atlanta before dawn on a Friday in late September of 1953. I was 24 then, working days at the railroad and saving most of my pay for school. The city had felt stale all week, so when James suggested a weekend in the woods by the Chattahoochee, I agreed at once. We wanted a break, a place to fish, drink a fee over a fire, and sleep on the ground with no one around. There were 4 of us in the car. James drove his new Chevrolet and treated it like a valuable possession. He carried a pocket knife, kept his boots oiled, and talked about the army more than his job. Beside him sat Robert, older than the rest of us by 10 years, quiet with a habit of rubbing his jaw when he thought. In the back, I sat with Mary, James's cousin. She watched the road with calm eyes and spoke only when she meant it. We brought a canvas tent, bedrolls, a small iron skillet, an cooler. Robert had a fishing rod and a jar of worms. James had a second-hand 3030. He said it was for snakes and any trouble we might find. Mary asked what trouble he expected. James shrugged and said it was good to be ready. The road out of the city went smooth at first. Then the houses, stores, and pavement ended, and we passed fields and pine stands. By mid-morning, we were on a dirt road, the car jolting over ruts. Dust came through the windows and left grit on our lips. James seemed happy to be back in country, he knew, pointing out old barns and turns in the track. Robert listened without comment. Mary stayed quiet, but her eyes moved over every fence line and tree break as if she weighed taken note for later. We stopped once at a general store for gas and bread. The man behind the counter was gray-haired and slow with his change. He asked where we were headed. James told him the river flats near Miller Bridge. The man's face tightened. He said that stretch was quiet this time of year. James said that was why we chose it. Damon hesitated, then told us to keep our fire up after dark and to stay together if we walked. He said it like plain of us. James thanked him and paid, but as we stepped back outside, he laughed and said, "Old men always had something to say about the woods." Back in the car, Robert did not laugh. He asked with man-meant. James said it was probably talk about wild dogs, troublemakers, or nothing at all. Mary turned in her seat and said the man looked scared, not bored. James answered that people around there were nervous. I listened and said nothing. I did not want to spoil the trip before it began. We reached the bend in the river around noon and parked where the dirt road ended. From there, we carried everything downhill on foot. The path was narrow, pressed into the clay by deer and fishermen. The river was not wide, but it moved fast over stones. The banks were thick with cane and alder. The air smelled of wet leaves and mud. There were no engines, no voices, only water and wind through the trees. I remember feeling that we had stepped into a separate place, one that could hold a person overnight without marking them. We chose a flat patch under 2 tall pines. James and Robert raised steepened while I gathered dead wood. Mary set stones in a circle for a fire ring and laid the coffee pot nearby. She worked with steady hands, and when she finished, she brushed the pine needles from her skirt as if she had done it 100 times. We ate bread and cold ham in the shade. After lunch, Robert went to the river with his rod. James walked upstream with the rifle over his shoulder, saying he wanted a good place to cast. Mary and I stayed near camp. She showed me how to tie a line on a spare hook, even though I told her I already knew. We talked about town, work, and small things that meant nothing. She asked about my mother's health and whether I still planned to take night classes. I said yes, and felt better saying it out loud. By mid-afternoon, the light softened and the heat eased. Robert called out that he had caught to bream. James came back with a burlap sack of catfish. We cleaned the fish on a rock near Thiwata Hands. Slick with scales, the waste drifted away on the current. While I was rinsing my knife, I heard a voice from the trees across the river. It sounded like a man calling once, a rough hey. It carried over the water and Dunn stopped. James heard it too. He straightened and listened. Mary asked if someone was on the other bank. Robert scanned the trees. We saw no one. The brush was thick and the river bent so we could not see far. James said it was probably a fisherman further down and we went on working. Still, I found myself listening again after that, even when no sound came. We carried the cleaned fish back to camp. James salted them and set them in the skillet. The scent of frying oil rose with the smoke. We ate until we were full, then watched. The river darkened. The first stars came out through the branches. Somewhere upstream, an owl called twice. I remember thinking it was the kind of night people wished for in the Middle App City summer. After supper, James walked a few yards into the trees to relieve himself. He came back fast with a tired look. He said he had found fresh hoof prints in the damp soil behind camp. Robert asked if they were deer. James hooked his head and said they were too large and split deeper than deer tracks. He said they looked like goat prints. Mary asked if there were goats out there. James said farms sometimes lost animals. Robert went to look with him. When they returned, Robert said the tracks were recent and led toward the river before turning back into the trees. He did not say much else, but his voice had turned careful. We tried to settle in for the night. The fire burned low, and we fed it in turns. Mary rolled out her blanket inside the tent and went in early. Robert lay down near the fire with his hat over his face. James and I sat a while longer, voices kept low. He talked about hunting here when he was younger and about old stories people told along the water. One of them, he said, was about something called the Goatman. He said the name with a grin me and 2 T's, but I noticed that he kept looking past the fire and into the dark trees as he spoke. James said, folks upriver told stories when he was younger. He said it started with missing livestock, then trespassers who never came back. Then, a boy who wandered off from a church picnic and was found 2 days later under a bridge, shivering and doonable to talk about what he saw. Robert moved his hat off his face and watched James with his eyes half-lidded, following each word. James said the people along the river blamed something that walked on 2 legs and 2 hoovastat stepped between trees without making sound. He said they called it the Goatman. Some said it watched from thieges of campfires. Others claimed it moved closer when people argued or when someone left the group alone. He said older fishermen refused certain bends in the river after dark. I asked if he believed any of that. James shrugged. He said he spent time in those woods as a boy and had never seen more than snakes and tracks. He said his father told him Thee's story to keep him from running off at night. Mary parted the tent flap and looked at us. She said we were talking loud enough for half the forest to hear. James apologized. then repeated the name Goatman with extra emphasis, as if to push that fear away with humor. Mary did not smile. She withdrew into the tent again and tied the flap. When it was my turn to lie down, I took off my boots and stretched out near the fire. I listened to the river and tried Torlex. James sat propped on his pack with the rifle across his legs. He said he would take first watch for no reason other than habit. Robert faced the trees and went still. I drifted in and out off sleep. The crackle of branches in the coals and the rush of water blurred together. For a while, there was only that and my breathing. Then another sound cut through it. It was faint over my shoulder. A single short call. It sounded enough like my name, too. Make my chest tighten. Tom. My eyes opened. The sound had come from beyond the fire, from the line of trees behind James. I could not see much past the glow, only the shape of trunks and branches. James turned his head in the same direction. I knew he had heard it too, because he reached for the rifle with one hand and touched my ankle with the other. You hear that? He whispered. I said, yes. My mouth felt dry. Robert sat up, still half asleep. He asked what was wrong. Before either of us answered, the sound came again. The exact same tone, the same length, as if a record had been replayed. Only this time, it did not say my name. It said James's. James? Mary called out from the tent and asked what we were doing. Her voice sounded tired and annoyed. Her what? Cut through the air in a full sentence. The voice in the trees had no shape beyond that one word it spoke. Mary could not have reached that part of the clearing without us hearing the zipper, and she did not sound the same. James stood up and faced the dark. He shone his flashlight toward the tree line. The beam caught only close branches and pale strips of bark. There was no figure, no ways reflecting. The voice said nothing further. The woods went back to the river and the wind. Robert got to his feet and moved around to the back of the tent. He scanned the ground and the trees, then returned to the fire and shook his head. He said he did not see anyone, no prints near camp besides our own and the cloven tracks from earlier. I wanted to tell him he must have missed something because the alternative felt worse. But the words stayed in my throat. Mary unzipped the tent. Flappin stepped out, pulling her sweater tight. She looked from James to me, then toward the trees. She asked again what had happened. James told her it was probably sound carrying from downriver and that we had imagined the names. Robert watched James while he said it. Mary did not argue, but she stayed by the fire instead of returning to her blanket. We sat up later than planned. After that, James kept the rifle close. Mary added more wood to the fire than it needed. The yellow light spread farther across the ground, pushing the dark back by a few more yards. It gave me little comfort. The idea of that voice hanging in the trees stayed with me. After a while, the night grew heavy on us. Robert said we would be no good for hiking or fishing if we did not rest. James agreed and we set a loose schedule. Robert took the rifle for the next stretch and sat with his back to a pint. James and I went into the tent with Mary. She lay between us, the canvas low over our faces and the smell of smoke clinging to our clothes. She whispered and asked if we were in danger. I told her no and felt wrong doing it. James said there were. At most some kids playing tricks or drunk out in the woods, and that 2 armed men were enough to handle that. She did not sound convinced, but she went quiet. I slept in short bursts. I woke once to hear Robert's boots walking past the tent and the crunch of needles underfoot as he moved along the edge of camp. I heard nothing else and drifted aft again. When I woke second, the sky had started to pale. The fire was mostly ash. James was outside again, putting more branches on the coals and Robert sat nearby with the rifle across his knees. No one spoke at first. Mary stepped out, rubbing her eyes. She asked if anything else had happened during the night. Robert said there had been no more voices. Then he said there had been other things. He pointed toward the trees at the back of camp. In the sandy soil, there were more tracks. They were deeper than before and covered the area where we had walked at dusk. Some came within a few yards of the tent. They were spaced in a way that showed a long stride. They made a circle, Robert said. Whoever or whatever it is walked around us while we slept. James crouched and studied the ground. He said again that the prints were not deer. The edges were sharp and the weight that made them was heavy. Hess stood and looked toward the direction the tracks traveled. They moved away from camp and toward a rise of thicker trees, where the undergrowth cast a heavy shadow. Mary crossed her arms and said we should pack and go back to the car. She said the weekend was not worth this. I felt the same, though I did not say it at once. James frowned and said there was no point in rushing. He did not want to be driven off by some prankster. He suggested cooking breakfast and seeing how the day fell. Robert stayed neutral. He said we should at least eat before making choices. He went to the river to wash his hands. I followed him. The air near the water was cool and carried the smell of wet stone. We knelt at the bank end, rinsed the dirt from our fingers. While we were there, a different scent came through. It was sour and heavy, as if something damp and unwashed stood close by. I turned my head, expecting to see an animal. Upwind, but the trees beneath us were empty. Robert smelled it, too. His shoulders stiffened. He murmured that it was not skunk and not rot, but something in between, something that belonged on a large body that did not bathe and never dried. The odor clung tough back of my throat. Then a breeze off the river shifted and the scent thinned. We walked back to camp in silence. Mary had the skillet ready and cracked eggs over the remaining fat from the fish. She moved quickly, eyes flicking to Tetris more than the food. James tried to keep conversation going. He asked if we remembered trips from younger years, other campouts with harmless scares. His voice had more energy than his face. The skin around his eyes stayed tight. I watched all of them while I chewed. Mary stayed tense. Robert checked the try and bait wean bites. James pretended we were on a normal trip. None of us mentioned the voice again, though it sat behind the very word. After eating, Mary repeated that we should leave. She spoke more firmly and said the warnings. From Field's storekeeper, the tracks, the sounds, and the smell added up to something we could not dismiss. She said there was no shimmy in walking away. James argued. He said the river was calm, the weather was good, and that men had camped there. Foyer. He insisted we had weapons, daylight coming, and nothing concrete to fear. He accused Mary of letting stories turn her imagination against her. Mary's jaw clenched, and her eyes hardened. That small shift in her expression told me she would not forgive that easily. Robert raised a hand and said they could settle it by staying one more day and deciding tonight whether to pack out in the morning. He said, Westhold not barge through the woods while we were exhausted. Mary looked at me and asked my opinion. I felt pressure from all sides. In the end, I said we could stay through the afternoon and judge by then. It was not courage. It was reluctance to stand alone against them. So we stayed. We cleaned up camp and hung the remaining food from a branch to keep animals away. James suggested exploring inland to see where the tracks led. Mary refused to go anywhere away from the river. Robert said we should not split up. James and I would scout a short distance into the trees, while Robert and Mary waited at the riverbank within sight of camp. Before we left, Robert checked the rifle and handed it to me. He said James already knew these woods, and that an extra level of caution would not hurt. James gave a short laugh and said we were acting like soldiers on patrol. I did not feel the humor. We stepped into the trees, following the trail of hoofprints. The ground rose beneath our feet, the soil drier away from the river. The understory thickened, branches pressing close. The sound of water faded behind us, and the forest closed in. The ground felt uneven as we moved uphill, and the prints Goatman, where fallen needles had been pressed aside. The spacing between them stayed long, each step farther apart than any person could manage. James walked ahead with steady pace, scanning between trunks. I stayed a few feet behind, watching both the path forward and the space to our right, where the shadows looked thicker. We reached Asmal Rise, where the undergrowth thinned. From there, the tracks shifted direction and angled deeper into Thuits. James stopped and crouched. He ran a hand along the edge of one print and held his fingers apart to show Thuit. The split was wide and the edges showed no crumble, as if whatever made them placed its weight with care. "Something big," he murmured. I nodded. My stomach tightened as I studied how fresh the marks looked. Bits of loose dirt still clung to the sides, not yet disturbed by wind or falling needles. James stood and asked if we should keep going. I hesitated. The river was out of sight now, and the ground sloped so Dats could not see camp. Every direction looked the same. I suggested turning back and telling the others what we found. James agreed, but he cast one more look into the trees. Before we turned around, I saw him tilt his head slightly like he was trying to catch a sound, but he said nothing. We walked back at a faster pace. The air felt heavier than before, and I kept checking behind us. At one point, I thought I heard a branch shift to our left. James paused too, raising a hand. We listened, but nothing followed. We resumed until the slope flattened. As we neared the river, the air changed again, carrying that same sour, heavy smell we had noticed earlier. It drifted between the trunks, stronger now, thick enough to make me squeeze my breath short. James stiffened and said, "We should hurry." When the river came into view, I felt relief, but it lasted only a moment. Robert and Mary were standing near the water with tent shoulders. Robert held the tent mallet in one hand and scanned the trees. Behind them, Mary clutched her jacket close to her chest. They both looked at us as we emerged from the brush. Mary asked what weaponed. James said only that the tracks led deeper and we did not want to go far without them. Robert looked past us toward the direction we came from. He asked if either of us had noticed anything following. James answered no, though his tone lacked its earlier confidence. I remained quiet. Mary pointed to the far side of the river. She said something had passed through the brush while we were gone. She described branches shaking and a brief glimpse of something tall moving upright on the slope. Robert added that the movement had been quick, more controlled than anything like a deer. James asked why they had not called out. Robert said the thing never came near them and they did not want to draw attention. Mary said the smell had spread right after, then faded. We stood together, the four of us looking across the water. The opposite bank appeared undisturbed, but the silence over it made me uneasy. James shifted the rifle to his right hand and said, "We should stay near camp until midday, then decide whether to leave." Mary did not respond, but the tension in her shoulders did not ease. Back at camp, we kept close together. Robert checked the edges of the clearing for new tracks, but found none. Mary gathered the cooking gear and repacked her bag as if preparing for a sudden departure. James paced near the pines, scanning the perimeter. I watched all of them and tried to settle the unrest in my chest. It did not settle. Around noon, the air warmed, but the woods stayed quiet. Even the birds that had chirped at daybreak seemed. To avoid ore clearing, James proposed walking downstream as a group to see if there was a better place to camp. He claimed that the location might be attracting animals. No one challenged him directly, but none of us wanted to wander far. Robert suggested we take the path along the riverbank. It would keep us close to water and make it easier to return Tuthkar if we needed to. James agreed. Mary said she would go only if we took everything with us. She did not want to come back later for our equipment. James frowned, but did not argue. We took down the tent and packed fast. Every sound felt loud, each snap of canvas or clank of metal ringing through the trees. When the last of the gear was loaded into ore packs, we began walking downstream in single file. Robert led with the mallet tucked into his belt. James stayed behind him, carrying the rifle ready. Mary walked behind me, silent, glancing behind us often. The river to our left made a constant low noise. The ground near it was soft and left clear impressions as we passed. That bothered Eden. It meant our trail would be visible to anything watching. James said it did not matter. I did not believe that. After a few minutes, the path narrowed to a thin strip between the river and a cluster of thick trees. We slowed to move carefully. A fallen branch lay across the path. Robert stepped over it. James followed. When I raised my foot, something cracked in the brush ahead and to the right. It was not a small sound. It was the sharp break of a heavy weight in brittle wood. "Stop," Robert said. We froze. Mary stood behind me, breath held. James gripped the rifle and angled himself toward the noise. The bushes shifted again, just slightly, as if something leaned against them. Then the smell reached us stronger than before, a heavy, wet odor that made my stomach turn. James raised the rifle and called out, telling whoever was there to shout themselves. No answer came. The brush stayed still. The smell grew thicker, flowing along the ground like warm, damp air rolling downhill. Robert motioned slowly for us to back up. We stepped backward in a quiet line, careful not to trip on the branch behind us. The brush did not move further. Phesmal lingered. After a dozen slow steps, we reached a wider part of the trail. James exhaled and lowered the. He said we needed to keep moving and put distance between ourselves and that spot. Mary asked if he saw anything. James shook his head. He avoided her eyes. I noticed how tightly he held the rifle stock. We continued along the river. No one spoke. I kept glancing at the trees to our right. The sense of being watched clung to me. Mary touched my shoulder at one point and whispered if I felt the same. I nodded. There was no point pretending otherwise. When we reached a bend in the river, the land rose into a cleared patch with fewer trees. Robert stopped and said, "Wessold, rest there just for a few minutes." Mary wanted to keep moving, but her voice wavered. James insisted, "Wedeki, time to drink water." We dropped our packs and sat in a loose circle facing outward. The river curved, wide and shallow at that bend. Sunlight hit the water, making it look lighter than the shaded banks behind us. I drank slowly, trying to calm my breathing. Robert pointed to the far bank and said he thought he saw something shift behind a stump. We all stared, but nothing moved. James said it could have been a deer. Robert kept watching that spot with narrowed eyes. The tension grew dense between us. I felt pressure in my chest as if the woods were closing in. I tried to steady myself by focusing on practical details. The sun was above us. The car was half a day's walk upstream. The river gave us a landmark. We were not alone. But none of that eased the dread. Then from behind us in the trees, a single knock of wood echoed across the clearing. One sharp hit, Not a branch falling, not an animal. A deliberate strike, like something heavy hitting a trunk once, and then waiting. Mary's breath hitched. Robert stood fast and gripped the mallet. James raised the rifle toward the sound. I looked into the trees, but saw only shadows. Another knock came. Same tone, same exact interval. It sounded closer. Then a third knock. Closer still. We grabbed our packs. With no discussion. James told us to stay tight and move back toward the car. His voice was taut but controlled. Robert positioned himself, hind Mary. I kept close beside James. We started walking. The woods behind us stayed silent, but the smell drifted again, faint. But present enough to confirm that the knocking was not random. It followed us, and then after about 30 yards we heard a new sound. A footstep in the leaves behind us. Heavy, deliberate, not in a hurry, just trailing our path. We did not look back. We only walked faster. I followed the river upstream with urgent steps, keeping our formation tight. None of us spoke. Our breaths turned unevenness. We pushed through narrow patches, where brush scraped our sleeves. The river stayed on our left, but even its constant rushing felt quieter than before, as if something in the forest was absorbing sound. The footsteps bent us stayed. Steady. Not loud enough to pinpoint distance, but close enough that each one landed with weight. Mary kept looking over her shoulder despite James telling her not to. Each time she turned, her face blanched a little more. After several minutes, James told us to stop. We froze in place. The footsteps stopped, too. We stood in a line, listening. A breeze passed through the trees and lifted the smell again, thicker now. My skin prickled. James gestured with 2 fingers toward a cluster of rocks near the river. We moved behind them and crouched low. Robert held the mallet tight. James steadied, the rifle on his knee. Mary covered her mouth to keep her breath quiet. I leaned forward enough to see between the trunks behind us. For a long moment nothing moved. Then branches parted about 20 yards back. A tall shape stood there, not fully visible, butte now to see the height and width. The fur looked dark and coarse. The legs bent backward. The horns curved from an arrow. Long head. It did not move. It just stood behind the trees, barely concealed. The way it held still made my chest tighten. If it had lunged or shifted, I could have reacted. But its stillness felt deliberate, as though it was watching our exact positions. James whispered that we should keep moving and not run unless we had to. We rose slowly, keeping our eyes on the trees. The creature remained half-shadowed, showing no intent, only presence. Dusmal stretched across the clearing, damp and strong. We moved again, faster this time. The tracks along the river grew familiar as we approached the area near camp. When the trees thinned enough for sunlight to break through, I breathed a little deeper. But the footsteps returned as soon as we reascended the slope that led up toward our original campsite. They were closer now, heavier. They came in pairs, then pairs again, as though it took its time deciding how close to follow. When we reached the clearing, the fire pit and scattered pine needles looked unaffected. Nothing had touched the spot where we slept, but it felt different now. The air inside the clearing held a thick tension. Robert checked the edges for new tracks. His shoulders dropped slightly when he saw nothing recent, but his jaw stayed set. James said we needed to get to the car before dusk. Mary agreed immediately. She tightened her pack straps and motioned for us to start climbing Thepeth up the hill. I followed close behind her with James directly behind me and Robert bringing up the rear. The trail rose steep from the riverbank. It twisted between low brush and exposed roots. As we climbed, The forest behind us went quiet again. I kept expecting the smell to return or for that heavy step to land on the trail below. But the silence held. Only our own breaths and the faint sound of the river drifted up. We reached a midpoint where the trail vaulted for several yards. There, a new set of tracks cut across the path. Deep, fresh. They sank through the top layer of soil into compact earth. James knelt and touched the edge. He said they were no more than an hour old. Mary backed away and covered her mouth again. Robert stood in place and did not comment. Thetrix led downslope toward the river, the same direction we had come from. But another set angled uphill toward Decker. That stopped us. James stood gripping the rifle. He said nothing, but his expression told the truth. It had been near the car already, possibly even watched us arrive. Mary whispered that we should run the rest of the way. Robert shook his head. He said if we ran without seeing where it was, we might run into it. James agreed and said we would stay close, move steady, and make noise so nothing could approach without us hearing. We resumed the climb. Theor grew warmer as the trees thinned. A few rays of sunlight broke through the canopy. I focused on each step and keeping Mary within reach. James kept scanning the sides of the trail. Robert turned often to check behind us. As one neared the top of the slope, the smell returned much stronger. It rolled down from somewhere above. Erie whispered, "Menane," barely audible. James raised the rifle halfway to his shoulder. Robert gripped the mallet, knuckles white. We stayed in place, listening. At first, there was nothing. Then something scraped across, bark ahead and slight light over the right. A slow drag of weight, then another drag followed by silence. James mouthed that we should move left toward the open spaces near the car. The trail widened as we reached the final stretch. Sparse sunlight lit the ground. The car would be visible once we cleared the bend. We walked in a tight group, every muscle tense. My heartbeat felt heavy enough to hear. The smell thickened until breathing through the nose became difficult. A few more steps brought us around the bend. The car was in sight. 50 yards ahead, parked under a cluster of tall pines. Relief passed through me for an instant. Then something moved between two pines. A tall shape stepped out, half lit by afternoon sun. Its legs bent backward and ended in dark hooves pressed into the soil. Its torso rose straight, thick with fur. Its arms hung low, hands long, clawed, and still. The head had a narrow snout and curved horns that looked dull in daylight, but stood out unmistakably. The eyes caught the light. They glowed red, not bright, but visible even in the shade. It watched us with no sound and no shift in posture. Mary let out a sharp breath. James raised the rifle fully. Robert muttered something under his breath and tightened his grip on the mallet. I stood frozen for half a second, unable to look away from the eyes. The creature stepped once toward us, slow, heavy. The ground thudded softly under the weight. "James!" shouted for it to stop. It did not. It took another step. James fired. The shitty chewed across the ridge. Birds erupted from nearby branches and scattered into the sky. The creature jerked back, but did not fall. It moved backward into the shade, disappearing into the trees. No cry, no stumble, just a retreat into darkness. James chambered another round. Mary grabbed my arm and whispered that we had to get to the car now. Robert said the same. James hesitated, still aiming at the trees, but nodded. We moved toward the car as fast as we could without breaking into a run. The forest around us stayed quiet except for the soft settling of leaves disturbed by the shot. The smell faded slightly, but the tension did not. When reached the car, James ordered us inside. Mary climbed into the back seat. I slid next to her. Robert jumped into the passenger seat. James kept the rifle pointed out the window until the engine turned over. Before he drove, he scanned the terrain one last time. Nothing moved. The woods held still, as if waiting for us to leave. James pressed the gas. The tires spun in loose pine needles and then caught traction. The car shot forward up the last stretch off dirt road. No one spoke. The trees on both sides blurred. As we gained speed, we were halfway up the road when a loud crack echoed behind us, a hard, deep sound of something striking wood, then another and another. Each knock faster than the last, as though chasing us up the hill. James drove faster. Then Axe grew distant, then stopped altogether. When we reached the main road, he turned without slowing and headed back toward town. Only then did anyone speak, Mary whispered, that she saw its eyes follow us even after the shot. Robert said we should not go back for any reason. James kept his hands tight on the wheel and stared ahead. None of us looked behind us for the rest of the drive. James kept driving until the trees thinned and the road widened. The farther we got from the river, the Morethi tension loosened, but none of us relaxed fully. The sunlight ahead looked pale and distant, and the hum of Thingjin felt too loud. Mary wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Robert lowered the window a crack to let fresh air in. I kept my head turned toward the passenger window, watching the woods roll past. After several miles, James pulled off at a gravel turnout near an abandoned feed store. He stopped the car and told us he needed a minute. His hands shook slightly when he lifted them from the wheel. Robert said we should keep going. Butchum shook his head and stepped out. We followed him, though Mary stayed close to the car door. She kept glancing train, as if expecting something to appear. The feed store had warped boards and broken window frames, long stripped off anything valuable. The roof sagged. The place looked as though no one had touched it in years. James leaned with both hands on the hood and breathed deeply. Sweat soaked through the back of his shirt. He turned to us and said he needed to know if any of us saw the creature react. To the shot, Robert said he saw it jerk, but it didn't fall or stagger. I said the same. Mary said its eyes never changed, no even when the bullet hit. James stared down at the gravel and scraped his boot across it. He said the bullet should have dropped most things at that range. Robert suggested maybe the shot had only grazed it. James didn't answer. Mary asked if we were safe now. Her voice was thin. Robert said we were far enough that it wouldn't follow a moving vehicle for miles. He tried to sound certain. He didn't quite manage it. James straightened and told us to get back in. Before he opened his door, he said one last thing. We weren't telling Ganyan in town what happened. He said no one would believe it, and we didn't need the trouble. Robert agreed. Mary nodded without looking at him. I didn't answer out loud, but I understood. We drove again. The road into town looked familiar, but it didn't feel the same. Each mailbox and each stretch of farmland seemed strange under the memory of Thostrax and the way it stood watching us. We reached the first cluster of houses near the outskirts. Children played in art. A man loaded lumber into a truck. Of it looked normal, and for a moment I wondered if everything happened had been some shared mistake. Then the smell drifted into my memory again. Heavy, damp, impossible Tommy-scent. There had been nothing mistaken about that. We stopped at a diner on the edge of town. The sign boozed with a flickering light. James said he needed coffee before driving farther. None of us objected. Inside, the booths were half full. The smell of frying fat filled the air. The normally felt fragile like something one wrong word could crack. We took a booth in the corner. The waitress brought water and coffee. She asked if we were out camping. James said yes, then added that the trip didn't go well. She asked why. He hesitated, then said, "We had trouble with animals." She nodded without interest and walked away. Mary wrapped both hands around her cup. She asked if I should warn someone about the woods near the river. Robert said no. He said, anyone who went that far out already knew the stories. He mentioned the old storekeeper again and said the man had warned us without explaining anything. James, said locals, probably kept tight circles for their own reasons. I kept quiet until Mary asked what I thought. I said, the creature didn't attack when it could have. It watched. It followed. It tested us, but it didn't strike. Mary asked if I believed that meant something. I said I didn't know. James downed his coffee in a few swallows. Said the creature didn't need to attack if it wanted something else. He didn't explain. Mary didn't ask. That silence felt heavier than anything we had heard in the woods. We paid and left. James dropped Mary off at her home first. Shay hugged us each quickly, then went inside without looking back. Robert lived a few streets away, so we let him out next. He said he would check in tomorrow. He didn't shake hands. He simply closed the door and stood on his porch until we drove away. When it was just James and him, the car felt too quiet. He drove slower through his neighborhood, then pulled into my driveway. Before I opened Ed's door, he grabbed my arm. He asked me not to tell anyone the details. He said the fewer people who talked about it, the better. I told him I wouldn't. He looked at me for a long second, then mentioned the shot again. He said he kept replaying it in his head, how the creature didn't fall. He wondered aloud if it had learned what guns did. He wondered if that was why it moved behind the trees after the bullet struck. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. He let go of my arm. I got out and walked toward my front door. I didn't turn around until I heard Thin Jean fade. For the rest of that evening, I stayed inside. My mother asked why I looked worn out. I told her we'd hiked far and had a rough night. She didn't press. When I lay down that night, I kept thinking about the way the creature stood, motionless, watching. The smell came back every time I closed my eyes. I tried to convince myself that returning home meant leaving the danger behind. But when I stepped outside the next morning, something waited. On my perch, a deep-set hoof print in the soft dirt beside the steps. My breath stopped. The print was wide and freshly made. The soil around it was unsettled. I knelt and touched the edge. It was still firm, not softened by wind or morning sun. I stood and backed away from it. My chest tightened. I scanned the yard. Nothing moved. The street was empty. A neighbor's dog barked 2 houses down, but the sound didn't comfort me. I walked back inside Lockett's store and waited by the window. James arrived 20 minutes later. He must have been driving past on his way in town because he didn't call first. When he saw my face, he asked what was wrong. I showed him the print. He crouched and studied it without speaking. His jaw tightened. When he stood, he looked around the yard the same way he had looked into the trees the day before. He said it must have followed the car. I asked how far something like that could travel. James only said it moved faster than we did and didn't rest the way people did. Robert arrived soon after because James had contacted him. He knelt beside the print and swore under his breath. He said it couldn't stay in town without someone seeing it. James said, not everything left tracks where people will notice. I listened but didn't speak. My hands shook. Mary arrived later after James called her too. When she saw the print, she covered her mouth just like she had near the river. She asked why it had come here. No one answered. We gathered inside and closed all doors and windows. James said we needed a plan. Robert suggested contacting someone who knew locale stories, like the storekeeper. James said he didn't want rumors spreading or the sheriff involved. Mary said shouldn't care about rumors if the creature was anywhere near town. The argument grew tense. I listened to their voice and felt a heavy pressure build inside me. I thought of the creature standing still in the woods, its eyes tracking each of us. I thought of how it followed without rushing. I thought of how it stepped out at the car only when we had nowhere else to go. In a thought form that I didn't want to have, I told them the creature didn't attack us. It followed and watched. It knocked. It mimicked, but it never lunged. Not even when we were vulnerable. I said, maybe it wasn't leaving because it was waiting for something or someone. Mary stared at me. James looked away. Robert asked what I meant. I didn't answer, because answering meant saying something I didn't want to accept. That it had spoken my name first. Robert stood straight when he heard me say that. Mary's breathing changed, sharp but quiet. James' jaw flexed and he looked at the floor. No one argued with me. No one said I was wrong. The room felt too small after that, as if the walls had moved closer. James took a long breath and said the print could have been left before dawn, and that the creature might already be gone. He tried to make the words steady, but they came out strained. Robert said we should check around the house to confirm it wasn't still nearby. Mary stayed inside, leaning against the wall with her arms tied across her chest. James and Robert stepped out with the rifle. I followed them onto the porch, even though a part of me wanted to stay inside with the door shut. The air was cool. The street was still. A few leaves drifted across yard. Nothing seemed out of place at first. We walked a slow circle around the house. James checked every window and every path between trees. Robert scanned the ground for prints. When they reached the back fence, Robert called out. We walked over to him. There were more tracks along the grass behind the house. Not many. 3 impressions, all deep, all spaced far apart. They moved along the fence line, then angled away toward the tree line at the edge of the neighborhood. The last print faced the woods as though it had paused before leaving. James crouched by that print and touched the soil. His voice dropped too, low for the neighbors to hear. He said it had been watching, not hiding. Robert said nothing. He only stood still with his jaw clenched. Mary called from the porch and asked if it was still there. James stood and told her no. He said the tracks led away and that we wouldn't see it again. But when Hal looked at me, his eyes weren't confident. He knew the same thing I knew. It had followed us. It had stood in my yard. It had left when it wanted to. We went back inside. Mary sat at the kitchen table with her hands clasped tight. When she looked at me, her expression softened the way it had when cleaned fish by the river. She asked how long I'd been awake before finding the print. I told her I saw it the moment I stepped out the door. She nodded once and didn't ask further. Robert said we should tell the storekeeper what we saw. Maybe he knew more. James refused. He said the old man would repeat what we said to everyone. In town, he said hunters would go looking for the creature if word spread, and we didn't want that. Robert said maybe we did want that. James said hunters might bring danger closer instead of driving it away. The argument gained heat. Their voices got louder. I told them to stop. They both looked at me. My voice felt thick in my throat, but I spoke anyway. I said whatever we were dealing with wasn't something hunters or townspeople could handle. I said it had followed tracks we didn't see, moved silently except when it wanted us to hear, and stood still in ways no normal creature stood. I said a bullet didn't slow it. Mary whispered that we weren't meant to understand something like that. then shisked quietly if it would come for us again. Robert said no before anyone else could answer. James said the same. Both too fast, neither believable. I told them I didn't think it wanted us. I said I thought it wanted me. No one spoke for seconds. James put the rifle down on the counter and asked me why I thought that. I told him the truth, because there was no reason to hide it anymore. The voice in the woods had said my name first. Not quiet, not mistaken, clear, deliberate, and it said it before we ever saw the prints circling our tent. Mary clasped her eyes. Robert exhaled through his nose and looked away. James paced once across the room and then back. He stopped in front of me and asked if I believed, saying my name meant it wanted to take me. I said I didn't know. I said maybe it wanted me to separate from the group, or walk toward the trees at night, or turn and look when I shouldn't. I said it tried again the next morning with the tracks around my house. Mary asked what it would do if I left town for a while. She said I could go to Femi out west or stay with Robert's cousin in Augusta. I shook my head. I said it had followed me home. I didn't know how far something like that could travel. Running didn't seem like something that would fool it. We sat in the kitchen for a long time without speaking. The clock ticked. A car passed outside on the street. Normal sounds didn't make the tension change. Finally, James said he would stay with me that night. Robert said he would, too. Mary said she would come back in the evening with blankets and food. I told them they didn't have to do any of that. James said we weren't leaving anyone alone after what we saw. They stayed with me through afternoon. We talked about small things to distract ourselves. The weather, work, local news. None of us mentioned Death Woods. The rifle stayed on the table. As night approached, Mary returned with blankets and lanterns. The four of us sat in the living room. The windows stayed shut and the curtains closed. We kept one lamp on. The room felt warmer with them there, but the tension didn't leave me. Every hour or so, one of us would stand and check the front door or back windows. Nothing changed outside. No movement, no smell, no sounds in the yard. By midnight, Mary had fallen asleep against the arm of the couch. Robert rested with his eyes closed, but didn't fully sleep. James sat near the window with the rifle in his lap. I sat near the hallway, unable to relax. Sometime after 2 o'clock in the morning, a noise drifted across the yard. A single knock of wood. Not loud, not close, just enough to make my chest tighten. James heard it. Robert sat up straight. Mary stirred awake. We waited. No second knock followed. No footsteps, no smell, nothing. James said it was probably a branch falling. No one contradicted him. We stayed awake until dawn. The daylight brought little relief, but made the house feel less confined. Mary left first, saying she had to check on her aunt. Robert said he needed to return home, but would come back later if needed. James stayed behind another hour before leaving fort. When they all left, I stood alone in the doorway, unsure whether stepping outside meant inviting something closer. The yard looked normal. The print near the porch had dried and faded. The tracks along the fence were barely visible. The street was quiet as usual. The day passed without incident. So did next. And the next. No more prints appeared. No knocks, no smell, no signs of anything watching. The woods near the river went quiet in conversation. People talked about fishing and turkey season. No one mentioned anything strange. Weeks passed, then months. Robert moved to another town the following spring. He never camped again. Mary left the state with her aunt that summer. She rode Metwise from Alabama and didn't mention the woods. James stayed in town but kept to himself. More than before. When had talked he avoided anything about that trip. As for me, I tried to return to normal. For the most part, I succeeded, but every so often, I dreamt of the river and the bend where we stopped. In the dreams, the trees were quiet and the light dim. I never saw the creature. I only heard my name up the slope, always spoken in the same tone. It never came back to my porch. It never left new tracks. It never knocked again. But that fact that it followed once was enough. I carried that knowledge like a weight I couldn't put down. A few years later, he returned to the edge of those woods during a drive. Not inside them, not near the river, just close enough to see the tops of the trees.